All right, y'all, welcome back to Anti-War Radio. It's Chaos in Austin, Texas, streaming live worldwide on the internet at chaosradioaustin.org and at antiwar.com/radio. And I want to point you guys to a couple of 2 or 3 articles here. Total defeat for U.S. in Iraq at counterpunch.org. Also, each shoe was worth 1,000 words, and also the latest one for the Independent in the United Kingdom. Keep out. A message for foreign leaders. It's Patrick Cockburn. He's the best Western reporter covering the Iraq War this entire time. He's the author of the book Muqtada. Welcome back to the show, Patrick.
Glad to be back.
I'm very happy to have you here. Now, let's get right to this total defeat for the U.S. in Iraq. I have to tell you, I've been watching the news lately, reading the news and seeing Ray Odierno, for example, saying that, whatever the SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement says, we're going to do whatever we want. And if it says we have to leave the Iraqi cities by a certain date, we don't have to. And if they say we have to be out of the country by 2011, well, don't worry, that's a long time from now. We can renegotiate and so forth like that. And yet it seems your take in this article, which admittedly is from the 11th, so I don't know what your opinion is today, but as of this writing, you seem to think that this Status of Forces Agreement really spells the end of the American occupation of Iraq.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's no question of this. The Iraqis read it that way. I remember one very significant thing about this agreement, that the Iranians went along with it. It wouldn't have passed without Iranian agreement.
Right.
Now, the Iranians, above all, are keen to get the U.S. out of Iraq. If they thought the U.S. was going to stay, they wouldn't have backed this agreement.
Now, how keen are they on getting rid of us? Because, of course, this is something we've talked about over the last couple of years, at least with you and really this whole time, is the question of America installing the Dawa Party and Supreme Islamic Council, which are backed by Iran, but otherwise have seemed to be very weak. And so when Bush says, as they stand up, we'll stand down, that kind of thing, they've needed us. Our guys can't stand down because the Maliki government would fall, or at least it seemed that way for much of this time.
I mean, that was true in the past. I think Maliki probably now thinks he can survive, or at least his government can survive. He can also see, with elections come up, the provincial elections come up in January, and we have parliamentary elections later in the year. And one of the crucial things that happened when this agreement was being negotiated, the SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement between Iraq and the U.S., was that none of the political parties, dared do anything except demand the U.S. get out, because they knew they were facing election. If they did nothing else, they'd lose a lot of votes. So that was a sort of continual pressure, and it's going to go on being a pressure. One of the things that astonishes me is that this agreement hasn't attracted more attention in the rest of the world. After all, the war in Iraq has been, shaped the political landscape of our time. But this agreement seems to have been buried, I guess, because it was agreed, just at the time that the Obama administration was being formed, when we have the financial crisis. So people didn't really notice it. But this is, a critical event in the politics of our age.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to get a handle on this, really. I guess the bottom line is that if the Maliki government, which is really made up of most of the leadership of the biggest Shiite parties, if they insist we leave, we really have to leave. I'm sorry to use we so liberally here. If the U.S. government... If the Shiites say get out, that's it. We can't start the war over again against the Shiites.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. have trouble enough fighting the Sunni Arabs, who are only 20% of the population. They can't stay if they're opposed by the Shia as well. And that's always been true, and is true today. Also, there's the Iraqi armed forces are pretty big these days. Will they... how far will they cooperate with the U.S.? Then there's talk of, the Iraqi armed forces are not completely trained, but at the moment they're not really in the business of fighting anybody. the Shia militias were stood down by the Iranians earlier this year, the militias of Muqtada al-Sadr and the Mahdi army. And the Sunni have allied themselves with the U.S. for the moment. So there's an awful lot of violence in Iraq, but the Iraqi army isn't going to have to fight a great big war.
So when the American generals are making these statements that, we had to sign a piece of paper so we could stay, but it doesn't matter what the details are, et cetera, they're basically just fooling themselves. They're in a position, whether they realize it or not, where they really do have to get out by 2011, period.
Yeah, you can see this. And, I mean, another point, Scott, is, look at the reaction in Iraq, look at the reaction in the Muslim world to the shoe throwing at President Bush earlier this week.
Indeed, let's talk about that.
A guy who throws shoes.
I have a headline here that says that the Turkish maker of the shoe has this is the most popular shoe in the Muslim world now. Apparently, the company that makes this particular model of shoe that was thrown.
Yeah, no, it's you can imagine the expression on the face of the maker when he heard what use his shoe has been put to, and I guess they've been showing them out ever since. But this, the reaction in Iraq of suddenly you have demonstrations in favor of this young Shia journalist, not just in Shia areas of Iraq, but, in Sunni strongholds like Fallujah and Tikrit and Mosul. It's rather amazing that you have a across-the-board support for this young guy. And that sort of shows the general attitude towards the U.S. presence, the U.S. occupation of Iraq. Somehow the Odierno doesn't been able, and the others don't seem to be able to take this on board. I get the impression that, when Petraeus had a General Petraeus, a fairly acute sense of Iraqi politics, I don't think the successors are smart about this. But there's no doubt, in my mind that what it says in this agreement is going to happen, that U.S. forces are going to be out of the cities and towns and villages by summer 2009, and the U.S. forces are going to be out of Iraq in 2011. And if they aren't, there'll be a sort of tremendous row. This isn't something that can be blurred.
Right. Well, I sure hope you're right. I've wanted an end to this war since before it began, and I certainly would love to see it. Although I have to admit, I'm pessimistic I do understand your point that if the Dawa Party, the Mahdi Army, the Supreme Islamic Council, and all these Shiite factions are agreed that it's time to kick America out, that may be a force that really cannot be dealt with by the American Army, such as it's constituted in Iraq at that point. And yet, it seems like the establishment here in America is determined to hold on to this country, to keep some permanent bases, to stay forever, no matter what, hell or high water. I dare say they might even be willing to risk a massive, widespread Shia uprising and restarting the war in order to stay.
Yeah, but you see, they also have to deal with the Iraqi army and police these days. It's very difficult to operate without their cooperation. And it's dubious if they'd get it. It's also always been true in Iraq that if Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani said the occupation is going to end, then the occupation is going to end. This is somebody whose instructions are followed by, not just laborers in the markets, but generals commanding the army. So, whatever happens, I think that there's no way of avoiding an end to the occupation. So I think that this idea, there's an idea sort of on the far right that somehow doesn't much matter what these guys in Iraq say, though you would have thought one of the lessons of the whole Iraqi occupation of the whole last 6 years, it really does matter what Iraqis think and what Iraqis do. And then I think there's a fear on the left and among opponents of the war that somehow this is one more con, that this is one more spurious turning point and nothing much is going to really happen. But I think that's wrong. I think that's cynical. I think that this is really going to happen now.
Well, I'm not sure. I guess I'm thinking of the different lies that they've used, the various turning points. But But, the theme is that everything now is basically the eye of the storm. And, of course, we've talked before about, you call the surge working. There are still millions of refugees who are afraid to come home. There's still widespread violence that makes Iraq one of the most, if not the most violent place on earth right now. The surge only worked compared to the absolute slaughter of 2006 and 7. And yet, when the lie then, the spin then was that we can't leave now in the middle of this terrible crisis. We have to see this through till things are okay. Now they say things are okay, but we can't leave because then everything might fall apart. And in a sense, that seems kind of right, and doesn't it, in the sense that, like, the former Sunni insurgency that they now call the Sons of Iraq are at peace because they're being paid to be at peace and to bide their time and rearm and prepare for the next battle of Baghdad, I guess, right?
I don't think so, no. I think, the Sunni were pretty heavily defeated. There may be some who think that way, but I doubt if it's going to happen unless... If you begin to have sectarian violence, let's say you have a really big bomb in some Shia shrine or marketplaces, you start having thousands of people killed again, then you have tit-for-tat killings by the Shia on the Sunni, that you have government troops, slaughtering people and so forth, then it might all start over again, but it hasn't happened yet. I mean, it's pretty violent, but it's not at the sort of butcheries that we had before. Also, bear in mind, there is quite sort of, one of the strange things about Iraq is the communities there, Kurds, Shia, Sunni, often hate each other, but at the same time there's quite strong Iraqi nationalism. They kind of really do want the U.S. out. And so things may just continue as they are on the present level of fairly high violence, but not a complete explosion.
Mm-hmm. So you think that there's a chance that for example, the Dawa Party and the leaders of the Sons of Iraq can come basically to a gentleman's agreement that, listen, you provide security in your area, we'll provide security in ours, and not fight?
Yeah, I mean, it could happen or that way. It depends how smart the government is. They come into Sunni areas. People were saying to me, in one area, the government came in, some Interior Ministry troops. They arrested 24 people. They released half of them, but the half who were released had all been beaten up, had broken limbs, and so forth. If there's a lot of that, then there's going to be a Sunni reaction. But that hasn't happened everywhere since.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess back to the story of the famous shoe thrower who will go down in the history of the world from now on. It's one of those events, and we have seen a few of these different ones from when Joe Biden passed his bill in the Senate saying we ought to divide Iraq in three after the Blackwater massacre around the same time. We've seen these kind of outbursts here and there, at least, of Iraqis coming together with this kind of nationalist, occupier out sort of thing, and maybe remembering from time to time that their differences with us are much more than their differences with each other.
Yeah, I mean, the two things I think go together. I think U.S. leverage in Iraq is going down. It's as the troops withdraw, it'll go down further. It's still a very dangerous place. I mean, and also a pretty miserable place. I keep on being told it's better, But usually I find I sometimes appear on radio programs and there's somebody in the green zone saying how great it is and restaurants are open and ice cream parlors are open. And but these guys never leave the green zone, or if they do, it's always with a couple of dozen heavily armed bodyguards.
So wait, pardon me. The stories where they're saying restaurants are again open, even that is still, when they're trying to make that comparison, these restaurants were closed before and now are open, they're still talking within the green zone wall?
Oh, sure, yeah. These guys, and often, you see television of somebody walking down the street, the correspondent walking down the street, but generally, there are a couple of armed guards with the cameraman that you don't see. But these other guys who are talking about, the restaurants being open, generally they're within the green zone. they don't go there. I do go out to restaurants, I mean, not many, but I'm very careful. And it's not exactly what everybody's doing in Baghdad. There's a little bit more life around, but there are some areas that restaurants are open, but other areas, the whole west half of Baghdad, things really start closing up at 7 in the evening.
When was the last time you were there?
I was there about just over a month ago.
Just over a month ago. And when you go there, and I think this is a measure of the violence, how many other journalists are willing to get in the back of a car and ride all around Iraq to the most dangerous places as you're willing to do?
There are people who do it. I mean, Scott, I think it works this way. I think that there are good print journalists. For instance, McClatchy, what used to be Knight Ridder, they're very good. There are other people, good print journalists, very brave, go out and do things. Television, there are good journalists, but it doesn't. Very little makes it onto the air, according to what they tell me. I mean, you see television over there. Do you see much about Iraq at the moment, or over the last 6 months?
Oh, certainly not. Everything is, just electoral politics and gossip and nonsense on TV.
Yeah, I mean, one of the networks there that has an operation that I'm told has an annual budget of $20 million, and the guys there were complaining they hadn't been on air for 50 consecutive days. So that, it's kind of disappeared from television. I think you still, if you go to the Internet and you pick out the best journalists, you can find people who go out and begin to get a picture of Iraq. I think, let's talk generally for a moment about the coverage of Iraq. I think the correspondents there have often done quite a good job. Where it really falls down is when you have the talking heads in Washington, saying what's happening, and retired generals and so forth. And then you get this undiluted propaganda mixed with almost total ignorance. People from the think tanks who are introduced as experts, former military officers, presented as if they were neutral observers. I think that's really been one of the major failings of the media over the last 6 years.
Yeah, well, and especially, over the last 2, it's been the silence. It's been the lie by omission, where they simply say, well, everybody know that the surge is working, or everybody knows that the surge has worked, and so it's over. Mara Liasson, who is supposedly this liberal news person from NPR News, but who also does Fox News Sunday Morning and so forth, commented the other day that the Iraq War is pretty much won, and George Bush is handing Barack Obama a very, stable and wonderful Iraq, and everything's great now. That George Bush, in fact, as people look back, they will be very forgiving of his Iraq War policy because, after all, it worked out just fine.
Yeah, it's kind of self-deception, and helped, as you say, by the fact, that it sort of disappeared from the airwaves. I mean, one of the sort of curious things is that the people who say this to me, and, I live in a hotel which is outside the green zone, and I sometimes say to them, well, come right over, come and see me, I'm not actually that far from the green zone, And either they say they won't turn up, or they turn up with lots of armed bodyguards. So has it changed a little? Yeah, but, not by that much. Again, that there are things which I think make very little news, like, that this new States of the Forces agreement, as I just mentioned, which is presented, if it's presented as a great military victory, how come, the main support for it is the Iranian government, perhaps not that friendly to the U.S. The decisive moment in this agreement being passed was the ministers that belonged to the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, which is the largest Shia party, got a telephone call from their leader saying, okay, guys, we now support this new agreement. And the leader was in Tehran. He'd just been told what the line was. That's
Abdul Aziz al-Hakim?
Yeah.
And he was in Tehran at the time he made the phone call?
He was in Tehran, yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, let me ask you this. Is there any kind of negotiation, or was there any negotiation about this agreement between somebody like Odierno and Petraeus and the Iranians?
Well, it was the agreement they kept on. Maliki sort of discovered earlier this year that the more nationalist line he took, saying he wanted the U.S. out. But originally in March, this seemed to be just a continue. When this negotiation started, it seemed that on the States of the Forces agreement, The U.S. side seemed to simply want the occupation to be continued as it had been under the UN, United Nations mandate, with no real change.
Sure, 58 bases and all that.
There was no time scale at that stage for any withdrawal. That was wholly against U.S. policy. This was rejected, strongly rejected by the Iraqi side, and Maliki continually refused to sign. Then eventually the U.S. agreed to a timescale for withdrawal. Originally this was meant to be conditional on security. What eventually they signed wasn't conditional at all, that they're going to be out by certain dates. And only then, that was when it got through the Iraqi parliament. But it's a complete transformation from what the U.S. wanted 9 months ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, the aspect of the Iraq war that I think gets the least coverage of all is the situation up in Kurdistan. And it, I guess, mostly just sort of goes understood that, everything's fine up there and they love us up there and et cetera like that. There really is a lot of violence up there in Kurdistan, and I've had various expert guests on the show over the years describe especially the city of Kirkuk as a powder keg or a pile of oily rags or a tinder box or something that's about to catch on fire, this whole time. I wonder if you can kind of update us on what it's like up there now.
One of the problems about Iraq is that people just got, that events happen, violence happens. If it happened anywhere else in the world, this would be, get a lot of coverage. But, just outside Kirkuk, there was a bomb in a restaurant, last week, that killed, I think, around 40-plus people. It hardly gets noticed outside Iraq. Somehow this no longer makes news. You have the dividing line between the Kurds and the Arabs in Iraq, which goes through Kirkuk, which the Kurds claim, but is also in Mosul, which is the third biggest city in Iraq, and right down to the border at a place called Kanakin. There's been continual fighting. Kirkuk itself, which is a terrible dump compared to, even compared to other parts of Iraq, there's no settlement there. And there's been sort of continual fighting. Mosul itself, most of the Kurds have fled from one part of the city, remains extremely violent. In some senses in Iraq, the divisions, the hostility between the Shia and Sunni Arabs has gone down, but the hostility between the Arabs in general and the Kurds has gone up.
And that is extremely important for the future of the entire region, right? The relationship between, the kind of difference between Iraqi nationalism holding these groups together, like we see during the shoe throwing and all that, versus Kurdish nationalism, which, of course, I'm value neutral on it, whose side to take or whatever, but it seems like if there ever really is an independent Kurdistan, which is one option here, then that means pieces of Syria and Turkey and Iran are in play and much further, chances for major conflict down the road from here.
Yeah, it could happen that way, but if the Kurds are smart in northern Iraq, they'll kind of play that down because they don't want to take on, they don't want to frighten the governments of neighboring countries that have got Kurdish minorities to the point that they're prepared to fight a war. For the first time, the Kurds are on the verge of having something pretty close to an independent country. They're an autonomous region in Iraq, but it's very close to an independent country. That's the first time the Kurds have had it. So the smart thing from their point of view is to try and consolidate that and not to really rile the Turks or the Syrians or the Iranians. Mm-hmm. But there's still a lot of friction in that area.
Well, and in recent months, the Turks have bombed the mountains there. I don't know if they've actually been effective at getting any of their enemies, but has that ceased over the past few months? Or?
Yeah, they keep on doing that. It's one of those sort of types of violence that somehow get accepted by people. It runs on the Reuters and AP wires, but nobody really pays much attention.
Right, two of America's allies at war against each other.
Sorry?
I said, yeah, two of America's allies at war against each other, and it gets a little nothing headline.
Yeah, they're attacking up in the mountains or along the Iranian border and along the border with Turkey. This is very sort of rugged terrain, deep canyons. Not quite sure what they're hitting. I mean, there aren't too many people living there, and with the bombing, there are even less. People move, particularly this time of year, people tend to move down to the cities because of the snow. I mean, it's an area I used to know quite well. Not sure I'm too keen on visiting it at the moment because the Turks are mainly hitting the roads, and there aren't too many of them. They're mainly tracks. But this has somehow become a sort of accepted part of the local scene that every so often accepted, that's say in Baghdad, not by local people, who are mostly sort of herdsmen and shepherds, that Turkish aircraft come over and bomb the hell out of the place.
All right, now, before I let you go, is there any good question I should have asked you? Is there something you'd like to address that I might not have thought of?
I think that somehow, it's a very sort of strange thing about Iraq that before the U.S. invaded, I don't think there was much knowledge of what was happening in Iraq. And now that the U.S. is departing, I think somehow there isn't much knowledge of what's happening here. I mean, there's this strange belief that the surge succeeded, which, just is demonstrably not so. I mean, what happened was really to do with other factors of the Sunni being defeated by the Shia, of Iranian support for the present government, and also a belief that somehow Iraq is at peace, despite the fact, this is contradicted not just by me, but by, just AP Wire, recounting what the daily death toll is, the amount of violence that's still going on, which is, it's extraordinarily a high level. So I don't think people have much of a picture, but maybe it makes it easier to carry out a withdrawal if people have a sense that, somehow they haven't been defeated. But, what's the consequence going to be this? Well, Iran is going to be becoming a regional power because the U.S., rather to the amazement of the Iranians, managed to knock off their two main enemies, Saddam Hussein and the Taliban, on each side of Iran. So Iran has become a regional power. And Iraq is going to go on being dominated by the Shia religious parties who've always been linked to Iran. Is there going to be an explosion in Iraq? I sort of doubt it. I mean, you will have seen that there has been sort of arrests in Baghdad at the moment. There's a struggle for power at the top. But this may not turn into any real fighting for a few years. At the moment, I think things might stabilize, but at a very high, horrific level of violence, which is too much for the 5 million refugees to go home.
Yeah, the 5 million refugees that are completely or almost entirely undiscussed anywhere in mass media, even in the European media that I try to read, very little coverage of the fact that there's still 5 million people who can't come home. But I guess, as you say, if there's any kind of benefit to this myth that the surge worked, maybe it's that the American people can finally somehow force our government to end this war, and they can save face by calling it a victory, whether they empower the Iranians or not. If they can leave Iraq somewhat stable, call it a win and call it a day.
Yeah, I mean, the only downside of that, Scott, is that it means that nobody much learns anything from what happened in Iraq. So maybe they'll do the same thing in Afghanistan and Pakistan, So, there isn't much that's been learnt from there. So the idea that you simply send more troops to Afghanistan and somehow things have come right are not contradicted by experience in Iraq, which is that, occupation troops, yeah, sure, maybe they might secure a few roads, but the one thing that happens everywhere is that local people don't like it. There's a reaction against the occupation.
Right, and of course, Afghanistan is more like fighting in Colorado than fighting out in a flat desert somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, all these places are pretty, but it's a complicated, sort of messy place, particularly if you rely on air power, with lots of civilian casualties. These drones are being used in parts of Pakistan without asking Pakistani permission. That creates, I've just been in Pakistan, a big reaction locally against the U.S. This is one more sort of messy situation. Overall, then you read stuff from the Washington think tanks describing Pakistan as a failed state or Afghanistan as a failed state. But there's one lesson of the last sort of 20 or more years that I think Washington should accept is that failed states are real dangerous places. They may not have regular armies, but they've got, these are societies who will fight for what they think are their own interests. But
well, and if they're ever going to be
a devastated place, but these guys still fight.
Well, and if they're ever going to be a non-failed state, their government is going to have the legitimacy that comes from being supported from the ground up, not from being installed by the United States from across the world.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I was just watching this week, that, as I said, I'd just been in Pakistan, that Condoleezza Rice turned up to see the president and had a press conference with him, and then Senator McCain turned up, was pictured with him, and then Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, did. Now, I guess these guys all think that this increases his power and influence. But, to Pakistanis watching it, they think, hold on a minute, this guy is a foreign puppet. We only see him when he's with foreign leaders.
Yeah. Well, and of course there's a massive protest in Pakistan yesterday about the American trucks going from Karachi and then up through the Khyber Pass and in Afghanistan, which have been attacked lately, apparently to such a degree that we've had to ask the Russians to let us use some of their old supply lines into Afghanistan.
Sure,
this is
pretty amazing. It wasn't just rockets. This was 200 or 300 armed guys in Peshawar, quite a large city, simply thrashed the depots where these trucks were, which is the main U.S. and NATO supply line. Peshawar is the mouth of the Khyber Pass going up to Kabul. They simply took over these depots and shot the guards if they didn't run away, and set fire to all the Humvees. This is a pretty amazing event.
Right. Well, all we got to do is surge into Afghanistan. Everything, I'm sure, will work out.
No,
I really want to thank you very much for your time on the show today, Patrick. It's been great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everybody, that's Patrick Cockburn, Middle East correspondent for the London Independent. You can also find what he writes at counterpunch.org.